Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Gita Kolluru. She's a biologist at California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo in California. Welcome, Gita.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, and I couldn't be happier. She is a fellow researcher of reproductive biology of animals. We have a lot in common, a lot to talk about. But really, what we wanted to focus on here was clearing up some misconceptions about the biology of sex and gender. As some of you might have noticed, many of our politicians are not getting this right. They're treating sex and gender as the same thing, and they're treating sex as if it's a dichotomy. So we're going to work to clarify some of these terms and what actually happens biologically. What is the biology of sex and gender? So I'm so happy to be joined again by Gita, who knows a ton about this and teaches about this. But first, why don't you tell us about yourself and how you got into this research and what you study?
Sure thing. So I am a behavioral ecologist. So I study animal behavior in an evolutionary context. And I arrived at this when I was an undergraduate student searching for an area of biology to specialize in. I knew I didn't want to be a physician, but I loved nature, I loved animals, and I wanted to find something that really spoke to me. And by chance, I went to see a departmental seminar, and that seminar really inspired me. It was a seminar on fish behavior and ecology, and that inspired me to do that kind of work. And so I pursued undergraduate research in a lab that was doing similar work, and that really started me on this path towards studying mating behavior and variation among individuals within a species in terms of their mating behavior, their aggressive behavior, other kinds of related traits that animals may have. And I really did not like the cold. I lived in Canada at the time. I am also Canadian, and I did my undergraduate degree in Canada, and I really wanted to escape from that. So I sought out graduate school opportunities really in places where, of course, the work was what I wanted to do. The person was who I wanted to work with, but that also were in places that were warm. So I found that. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I was very fortunate to find that opportunity at the University of California in Riverside. And I did my master's there with David Resnick on a tropical fish species that occurs in Costa Rica. It's only in Costa Rica.
Very cool.
And that was really thrilling. I had the opportunity to go there with him and find these fish in really what amounted to a ditch by the side of the road. So it was extremely exciting to realize that biologists could, on a little piece of paper, have GPS coordinates and then go find these animals. So that was really thrilling, exciting. We brought them back. I did my master's with them. Unfortunately, they didn't have any mating display. So my main goal, which was to study really ostentatious mating displays like what you may see in peacocks, something like that, these fish just simply didn't exhibit, which was interesting in and of itself. And so it was a productive and really enriching experience as an entry into graduate research. And then I did switch. I worked on crickets and a parasitoid fly, so a fly that parasitizes crickets, which was really fascinating for my PhD, which I did.
Can you pause for a second and just define for our audience what parasitoid is?
Yes. A parasitoid is similar to a parasite, except that the infection with the parasitoid is always fatal for the host. And most, if not all, parasitoids are insects. So things like wasps or flies that lay their eggs on other invertebrates. And that egg then hatches into a larva that eats that host as it develops and then, of course, kills the host. So it is absolutely gruesome and fascinating. And so I had the opportunity to study this cricket and its parasitic fly. And a perk of that research for my PhD, which was I did my PhD with Marlene Zook, also at UC Riverside. And a perk of this research was that I got to work in Hawaii, where the crickets and the flies were introduced.
That's amazing.
Not too shabby to work on an introduced species in Hawaii, so that I didn't feel that it was unethical to be working with these crickets, which I had to euthanize in some cases as part of the research, but because it is invasive, or at least not invasive, but because
Non-native.
it is a non-native
Yeah,
species, I felt that it was much less ethically difficult to conduct that work. And it was wonderful, another wonderful experience with a great mentor who helped to shape, who I am as a researcher and as an academic. And so I had really positive experiences
that's
throughout graduate
great.
school. It was a wonderful program in every way. So that was wonderful. And then I did a postdoctoral research fellowship at UCLA with Greg Grether and went back to my love for live bearing fishes. So the fish that I worked with for my master's was a Pisciliid fish. That's a family of fishes that are commonly referred to as live bearing fishes. And I really enjoyed working with those back when I was doing my master's. And so after my brief foray as a PhD student into the insect world, I returned to working with fish in that same family. And so after that postdoctoral research stint at UCLA, where I worked with live bearing fish called guppies that are maybe familiar to a lot of people
I
from
bet.
having
Mhm.
kept them as children or in pet stores, things like that. I then was fortunate enough to get this job at Cal Poly, which is the shortened version of this university. And I have been here. This is my 17th year ending. So it's been a wonderful position, my dream job, really. And so somehow I was fortunate enough to get that. So I feel
That's
very
great.
lucky,
Awesome. What a great journey and so many good influences along the way. And I'm sure you've
very
given
much
that
so.
to your students as well. I noticed at the beginning you were talking about how you study variation within a species in sexual behavior. So I was wondering if you could talk more about, like, I think some people might think, well, guppies do it this way, and I don't know, robins do it this way, and that there's one way that every individual of a certain species reproduces. But you're saying there's variation within species.
Variation within species is the most important thing for evolution to act on a species. So, as Darwin and Wallace first really emphasized, not everyone is the same within a species, and that is key for all of evolutionary biology, really. And so, when we're talking about mating behavior and associated traits like genitalia and aggressive behavior and territoriality and all kinds of things, not everyone within a species is the same. There is a lot of variation among individuals in just about any species that you can think of. And in some cases, such as the fish that I work with now, the variation is categorical. So some males produce coloration, and in some cases, they may produce other kinds of what are called ornaments, traits that are fancy and that are used to advertise for mates. So they may produce fancy looking tails or fins, things like that. And those males tend to court females prior to mating with them. So they perform a courtship display, and females have the opportunity to watch that display and decide if they want to mate with that male or not. And they can choose whether to mate with that male or not. And other males may do what's called sneak copulation or coercive mating. And this involves a male swimming up to a female, in the case of fish, swimming up to a female and copulating with her without her cooperation and without her consent. And so that is coercive because it doesn't allow females to choose who they're going to mate with. And this sets up a scenario where there are these two kinds of males. And for that to persist over time, they must have equal mating success in the case of genetically different ways of reproducing. And so there are costs and benefits to any type of strategy that a male may pursue in this scenario. And so, from the perspective of males, the males that court females are putting a lot of investment into these displays and these fancy ornaments and things like that. And they have to spend time courting the female, and they may not always get to mate with her if she rejects him. So there are costs, but the benefits are that females prefer the courting males because they
Mm,
afford the opportunity for females to have control over who they're mating with.
mhm.
The sneak copulating males, on the other hand, don't pay the cost of producing those displays, but they suffer a different kind of cost, which is that in lots of species, females who have been mated with by, for example, a sneak copulating male, they have ways of not using those sperm to fertilize their eggs.
Oh, we talked about this a little last season about cryptic female choice, but go for it. Yeah, let's bring it
Absolutely.
back in.
So
Yeah.
There could be cryptic female choice
Hmm.
such that a sneak copulating coercive male's sperm are selectively not used by females. This is not a conscious decision on the part of the females. It's an evolved response. She may have physical structures that can block these kinds of coercive mating attempts, for example.
Hmm.
There may be aspects of her reproductive tract that favor the sperm of the courting males more than the sneaking males. And so females are not without choice and not without control in these kinds of situations, even if there are sneak copulating males. So it's wonderful variation. And this kind of categorical variation exists in lots of species, in birds, in reptiles, in fishes like the ones I study. It's not something in insects. It's not something
Yeah.
that is confined just to the fish that I study. But this is one type of variation among individuals that is extraordinarily important.
Very cool. So we see this variation within species, and you said it's this categorical variation is seen across lots of different groups of animals. Is there also continuous variation that's seen across animals?
Absolutely. So then that is the other important type of variation. So
Yeah.
continuous variation refers to variation where there aren't discrete categories, but rather it's more continuous and quantitative, something analogous to human height, for example. So we don't just have categories of human height, it's a continuous variable, and every value is possible in between the smallest and the largest value. So there is continuous variation in the types of coloration that animals may exhibit. So all of those males who court females are not the same. Some of them have more intense coloration than others do. There's quantitative variation or continuous variation in that. There's continuous variation in body size among individuals in every species. There is also continuous variation among females in terms of what they prefer, what kinds of males they prefer, what kinds of traits they prefer, their ability to selectively use sperm from some males versus others. That varies continuously among females. And there's variation in terms of how well males can perform these sneak copulations. Not all males who do that are equally good at it.
Mhm.
So, this kind of variation generates the opportunity for natural selection or a related process called sexual selection to be able to favor some individuals over others in the population.
So far we've been talking about variation like within males and variation within females, but I want to turn to a new topic, which is really like sex itself and sex versus gender. What's the difference between sex and gender when we talk about it from a biological perspective or a sociological perspective? And then a lot of people present those as dichotomy, as if there's just two categories and there's nothing in between. So talking about whether there's any accuracy to that or what we know about that.
Almost nothing is binary in the natural world. And so sex itself is not binary in many species, including in humans. And so I want to begin by distinguishing sex and gender.
So, how would you define sex and gender?
So, speaking first to humans, sex and gender are not the same thing. That's the first thing to understand.
Mhm.
And so, sex in humans is typically determined using a range of different traits. So, it includes chromosomes. So, we do have sex chromosomes, but those are not binary. There's variation among individuals with respect to their sex chromosomes. It also includes things like external genitalia, and external genitalia are also not binary. There is a lot of variation among individuals with respect to that as well. And also whether individuals produce or are capable of producing sperm or eggs. Those are typically the three things we would use to distinguish the sex of a person. And that is really different from gender. Gender is a social construct, it's a way that a person describes themselves. And so a person who is assigned female at birth, for example, may identify as male, or they may identify as non-binary or one of many other possibilities. And the only way to know someone's gender is to speak with them about it. It's not something that is necessarily consistent with the way that they present. They may present as female and identify as non-binary, for example. So speaking with a person is the only way to know what their gender is, and these are not equivalent. Humans also exhibit spectra in multiple areas. So we have variation in terms of sex, in terms of gender expression, in terms of gender identity, in terms of sexual attraction, emotional attraction, sexual behavior. All of these things are different axes on which people vary, and none of those is binary. So it's a wonderful degree of variation that we exhibit. And I think that I don't want to make it sound like it's for the same reason, but other species also exhibit a lot of variation. And so, in terms of thinking that the variation that humans exhibit is not natural or making that kind of an argument,
Right.
that's not an accurate argument to make
It's just
because
not
that kind of
true.
variation occurs in all kinds of species. It's
Right.
also not an accurate argument to make if you only look at humans because there's variation in all of those in humans.
Right. But some people would say that that variation is abnormal or something like that when that's not fair or accurate either.
So in humans, sex is different from gender. So we exhibit variation in terms of sex, and I can talk about that, and I imagine we'll talk about that.
Mhm.
There's also variation in gender. So
Can I ask a quick question? So, if the only way to know someone's gender is to ask them, do we talk about gender in other species of animals?
So, gender in other species of animals is a fascinating topic
Mhm.
because what we, or I at least, used to say is gender is human specific. Please don't refer to the gender of the crabs that you're working with for this lab, because
Right.
I think people tend to do that in the popular media because they don't want to use the word sex.
Mhm.
And so I see people putting an Excel spreadsheet together with gender as one of the column headings. And what they mean is sex in that case.
Right.
However, I modify that a little bit because some researchers are starting to see that some species may exhibit gender as well as sex. So,
Mm.
some work with chimpanzees has suggested that some individuals who are assigned as female and who have all of the traits that are typical of females, for example, may take on male roles when it comes to their behavior in a myriad of ways, including mating. And so there may, in fact, be gender expression in other species that we just don't know about yet because we haven't studied it well enough. But that's a relatively new advance.
So that reminds me of the case with some cuttlefish species where they can change their color and patterns on a moment's notice, which is so cool. And I think the way it works is that smaller males can approach a female, and on the side of their body that's facing the female, they'll have male-like courtship coloration and pattern. And then on the other side of their body, they'll have female color and pattern that might make larger males court them, but would not signal that they're a male trying to mate with a female. It's so wild.
It is amazing. So they can simultaneously be courting a female, but avoid the aggression that may be directed at them otherwise by a larger male,
Absolutely.
and therefore secure that mating opportunity. It's
Right. So are
fascinating.
they crossing gender roles? I don't know. Yes.
Absolutely. I think that to a certain extent, it's how we define these terms, but I think that there is variation that we may very well consider gender variation in other species as well.
So interesting.
That's
So, this might be a good time for us to give a warning about the naturalistic fallacy, which is this idea that just because something is found in nature doesn't tell us anything about whether it's morally right or wrong in humans. It just says it's found in nature. It might tell us about the evolutionary pressures that resulted in that, what we call the phenotype, the trait that we're seeing. But it doesn't tell us that it's morally right or wrong. So always be careful. Like, it's not okay to say something's not natural if it's occurring in other species. We might say, yes, it's found in nature, so it's natural, but that doesn't tell us anything about whether it's right or wrong. So that goes for sexuality, it goes for violent behavior, it goes for all sorts of different behaviors. So it's really important to just heed that warning. So some people also kind of go the other way, that they'll say because it's found in other animals, because something is found in non-humans, that makes it wrong. It's something that animals do and humans don't do. We're better than animals, but we are animals. And so if you want to say it, first of all, you should say non-human animals to be correct. But
absolutely.
also it doesn't tell you anything, again, whether it's right or wrong if it's happening in other organisms.
And maybe this is a good time to talk about what generates the variation in sex
Yeah,
among people.
absolutely. That would be great.
We had talked about the ways that people would assign sex at birth, for example, to a human, that it involves the sex chromosomes, that it involves external genitalia, that it involves whether a person is capable of producing sperm or eggs. So, another way of saying that is whether a person has testes or ovaries. Those tend to be the constellation of traits that people use to assign sex at birth. And there are problems with using those to assign sex at birth in a binary way. In other words, using them to insist that a person either be male or female with no other options. We know that the variation among humans exists because of variation in all of those things. So just talking about sex chromosomes, the typical scenario that we may have all heard about is that females have two X chromosomes and males have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. And I don't know how much we want to get into meiosis, but there's a process called meiosis that makes eggs and makes sperm. And sometimes in the course of meiosis, the sex chromosomes don't go into separate cells in a way that's typical. Instead, a person may have three sex chromosomes, for example. So they may have X, X, Y. And those sex chromosomes for all of us, they end up in all of our cells, not just in some cells. So every single one of the cells in that person's body has two X chromosomes and one Y chromosome.
So, like during meiosis, which is the cell division that forms the gametes, the eggs and the sperm, you might get, instead of just one X chromosome from the mom, you might get an X, two X's, or instead of just getting a Y from into a sperm, you could get an X and a Y in a sperm.
Exactly right.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So a person may have just one X chromosome, and it's often referred to as XO. And that would be the situation in all of the cells of that person. So that's another type of variation that exists. So the situation where a person is XO is referred to as Turner syndrome. Sometimes we give names to these situations, and it's really important to me to get away from thinking about these things as disorders or diseases. They're not. It's just natural human variation. So we are moving to calling these differences of sexual development. So people use the acronym DSD, and it used to stand for disorders of sexual development. And that's still how it appears in scientific literature sometimes, even now in 2024. But I talk about these as differences of sexual development because they are not necessarily anything bad or a disease. So if a person has the XO condition, so if a person has the chromosomes that are XO, so only one X chromosome in their cells, we refer to that as Turner syndrome. And that does come with a constellation of other traits to do with physical appearance. Unfortunately, it also is accompanied by infertility. So there are some challenges to overcome for folks who are XO. If a person is XY, as we talked about. So they have three sex chromosomes instead of two in all of their cells. They have something called Klinefelter syndrome. So the kinds of traits that accompany Klinefelter syndrome include things like deposition of body fat in a way that is more typical of what we would think of as female typical deposition, and maybe a slightly smaller penis. So it's not something that a person necessarily even knows about themselves unless there's a reason for them to investigate. And that reason is typically when they are trying to have a child and they have infertility and may get tested for something like Klinefelter syndrome. Otherwise, neither they nor others may even know that they have Klinefelter syndrome. So this kind of variation is not something scary or awful or anything like that. People that you know may have some of these traits and you just don't even know it. They may not even know it. And I think it's really important to think about this kind of variation, just like we may not know what kind of MN blood type we each have, something like that. We may not know that about ourselves or about others by just looking at them, interacting with them, being friends with them. This is just natural variation and not something scary. A person can also have XYY, and that situation has been associated with a lot of stigmatization, unfortunately, because historically and in popular media that continues to today, people who are XYY were branded as being extremely aggressive, maybe with criminal tendencies, all kinds
like
of
too
awful things.
much maleness to
Too
them or
much
something.
maleness, absolutely. All kinds of things were attributed to them. And a study was published by someone who investigated prisoners in a prison and claimed that there was an overrepresentation of men with XYY as their sex chromosomes. And it turns out that there were many problems with that study that made it.
Like what kind of things?
The individuals weren't always what we call genotyped. The genotype wasn't always known. Genotype refers to what chromosomes they have in this case.
Okay.
So the person didn't necessarily know. Also, there were some problems with the sampling of people. There wasn't a random sampling of people to compare whether folks who are XYY really are more aggressive or not. And so it was a very problematic study and one that doesn't have any credence now. And in fact, people who have XYY as their sex chromosomes, they are slightly taller, and that's just about it. And this doesn't mean that if you know someone who identifies as male and is tall, it doesn't mean that they have XYY as their chromosomes, but But it also means that if you know someone who has XYY as their chromosomes, you probably don't even realize it because there's nothing about them that is different. And XYY is not associated with infertility. So the vast majority of people who have XYY don't know that they have that as their sex chromosomes. They never know throughout their lives. And that's absolutely fine. They don't need to necessarily. And there also is something called triple X, where a person may have 3 X chromosomes. That has been investigated less, but also, again, can be completely a typical normal lifespan and life. And people may not even know that they have this. So just with respect to that one axis of assigning sex, which is chromosomes, think of all the variation that exists with respect to that. And yes, some of those variations are associated with infertility. I don't want to minimize that challenge that people face, but really a lot of this variation exists without us knowing it. And we certainly should not ascribe any kinds of stereotype to those. But a person who has this kind of variation may identify, because of that, they may identify as what we call intersex. So intersex is the other way to identify that's not male and female. Some people may simply identify as non-binary with respect to sex, but some folks may identify as intersex, not just because of the chromosomes, but because of other things we can talk about. There are many reasons why a person may identify as intersex. And as of 2022 in the US, a person can list X as their sex on their passport, officially designating themselves as intersex. Intersex refers to people who are born with traits that cannot readily be put into a category of male or female. And so there's a range of things that can happen during development or genetically or otherwise that may cause a person to identify as intersex. And this could be with respect to their chromosomes. It could be with respect to their external genitalia, their internal genitalia, and other things as well. So we can talk about those. Some of the things that contribute to a person being described as intersex include the chromosomal variation that we just talked about. So someone who has Klinefelter syndrome, for example, or Turner syndrome may choose to identify as intersex. But there are a range of other things as well. So, for example, some hormonal differences in sexual development can cause a person to be intersex. One example is a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH, results from a mutation that happens in a particular gene. We don't need to get into the details here, but there's a gene that codes for producing an enzyme. And if there is a mutation, there's a whole series of events that happen during development. But one of the things that happens is the adrenal glands, which are glands that are located on top of the kidneys. Those adrenal glands end up becoming enlarged. And as a consequence of that, they produce excess hormones such as testosterone. And these are hormones that we typically associate with masculinization. So a person who has the chromosomes XX, which we would typically identify with female, may be born with CAH. And as a consequence, that person may have an enlarged clitoris. And so that clitoris may be enlarged to the point where the genitalia are described as ambiguous. And so that is one situation where a person may then identify as intersex. And a whole other area for us to potentially talk about is surgery that is often performed on babies long before they can give consent to try to fit people into the binary of male and female.
So, in addition to CAH, are there other mechanisms that affect the manifestation of traits associated with sex?
Yes, there are. Another one, which has been discussed quite a bit, thankfully, in the popular media, is something called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Under androgen insensitivity syndrome, a person who has XY chromosomes produce testosterone and other hormones similar to testosterone, but because of a mutation, they don't have the receptors that are able to bind to those hormones. And so they produce testosterone, but it's as though testosterone cannot have its effects on the person's traits. And so the person has XY chromosomes and they produce testes as a fetus. Those testes, though, stay inside the body because their receptors for testosterone don't bind to that testosterone. So the testes don't descend outside of the body. And for other, complicated reasons, the external genitalia resemble that we would typically associate with females. And so the baby is born and from the outside looks like a female and is typically identifies as female, or at least their family identifies that baby as female. And oftentimes nothing else is known until that person doesn't start to menstruate when they reach puberty. And so then they may go in for testing to determine why it is that they are not menstruating. And scans may reveal internal testes, and then tests may reveal that that person is XY, but they may very much identify as female. It's possible. So again, the person identifies their sex. So they may identify as female, they may identify as male, they may identify as intersex, or none of the above, depending on the person. Sometimes people may elect to have those internal testes removed. Sometimes they don't. And there have been some prominent cases of people coming forward and identifying themselves as intersex publicly. And I think that has contributed to destigmatizing this situation.
That's great. So as we wrap up, I'm wondering if a politician or a family member or a neighbor says to you or to one of our listeners, I don't understand the problem. People are born, they're male or female. Why do we have to have all this gender fluidity and sex fluidity? Why can't they just go to the bathroom that they were assigned to at birth? Like all these things. Is there like some simple message you feel like our listeners could give people to help explain the situation?
So what I may say is variation exists. We don't know what a person's chromosomes are. We don't know what their genitalia look like. We don't know what kinds of hormones their bodies are capable of producing. And undoubtedly, there are people that are different from the binary of male and female that we know. And so the important thing is to treat everyone with empathy and with respect. And variation exists. Not everybody has male typical or female typical genitalia. Not everybody's internal organs, testes, ovaries, match what they have externally with respect to their genitalia. Not everybody produces genitalia that look the same as what you may imagine to be male typical and female typical. There are people who have all kinds of reasons why their bodies are not able to fit into that binary. And because of that, we need to treat everyone with respect and respect how they identify. There is a whole range of biological reasons why people don't necessarily fit into that binary of male and female with respect to sex. And this could happen to anyone. This is not a moral choice. It's not something that people choose to do because it makes their lives easier to not be able to just go to the bathroom without having problems, right? No one would bring that upon themselves voluntarily. And this is not something that people are trying on because it's a trend and they saw their friends identify as intersex or something similar to that. None of these things is the case. This is something rooted in biology. There's variation in all kinds of traits. Not everyone has the same 2 eye colors or the same 2 hair colors or the same categories when it comes to height. This is variation that's biology based, just like variation in those traits. And it is often said that if you know someone who has red hair, you probably naturally red hair, you probably also know someone who is intersex. You just don't realize it.
Wow, that's
And
great.
so, because it's a similar rate with which intersex occurs in that population.
That's a good one. Yeah. And then on top of all that biology of sex, there's the gender component, which has part to do with biology, part to do with culture, part to do with upbringing and just your social interactions, all sorts of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, we cannot choose our gender identity any more so than we can choose sex or anything else, how tall we are, or, whether my hair is curly or straight. These are not things that we can necessarily choose. And so if a person identifies as gender non-binary, they don't fit into the stereotypes of male behavior or female behavior, that's variation that's important in our species and something that we should embrace. And I think our world is broadened by listening to people and by learning about the kind of variation that exists. I think we become better people as a consequence. And so trying to deny that or trying to squash that kind of variation is not going to make it go away. And I think it just generates a lot of suffering for people and also narrows our own experience in life.
Thank you so much for joining us today. That was so informative and uplifting to listen to.
Thank you very much. It's very much my pleasure.
Thank you all for listening, and to our production team, Natalia Ryusik, Isabel Espinoza, Sam Carmel, Lane Patton, and Pras Subadi. The music for this episode is entitled I Don't Smoke by the Mythical Score Society.